Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. The latest attempt by the Labour government to cut costs has faced a big backlash in Northern Ireland. The Stormont parties are united in expressing their concerns about what it might mean for the most vulnerable in society here. We'll hear what the largest and one of the smallest parties think. Also in the programme, it's increasingly big business, but is the world of Botox and fillers dangerously unregulated?
You know, things can go really, really wrong, and I could have been really severely disfigured.
We definitely need to have a minimum level of qualification before anyone is deemed safe to be injecting anything into anybody's face.
It's yet another big week in Westminster as the Chancellor is set to unveil her spring statement. We'll ask what it's likely to include. And with me to discuss all of that and more, the political correspondent of the Irish News, John Manley. Westminster sneezes and Northern Ireland catches a cold, with Labour making more cuts to those eligible for disability benefits. What will happen to those who depend on the payments here? The Communities Minister says attempts to mitigate the cuts would cost him £150 million. And that's money neither he nor the Executive has spare. Let's hear the thoughts of the Sinn Féin MLA Colm Gildernew and Jerry Carroll from People Before Profit. Welcome to both of you. Colm Gildernew, first of all, your party's already made it clear that it's opposed to these proposed changes to PIP. The question is, what are you going to do about it?
So, first of all, if I may, Mark, just to pass my best wishes on to Jerry. It's the first time I've seen him there since the appearance of abhorrent graffiti in Belfast. So I want to pass on my best wishes to Jerry and his clan in the face of hate mongers. These are totally disgraceful and unacceptable cuts that the British government are bringing forward. What they're doing is actually, once again, using austerity policies to attack the most vulnerable and the already most disadvantaged in our communities. It's an outworking of Brexit. They're trying to balance the books, and the people who they are picking on to do that are people who are already isolated from many of the opportunities that most of us take for granted.
OK, so we know that you're opposed to it. We know that you think the government is making a mistake in going down this road. But let me just repeat my question. What precisely are you going to do about it? What can you do about it?
Well, I believe we must stand full square, united against these cuts. You've said there's serious concern here. There's also serious concern across the water where parties there, and even indeed many members of the Labour Party, are reported who realise the folly of this approach. Because remember this, it will also be counterproductive in terms of increasing the need for public services. It's going to drive people further away from work. So what we have done in terms of the Committee for Communities, we have written to our counterpart committees in Scotland and Wales. We've written to the British Secretary of State. And what we are saying is here, no one must take their eye off the ball in terms of resisting these cuts. That's what needs to happen. These cuts need to be addressed at the level of the British Treasury.
OK, well, still no answer as to precisely what you're going to do apart from be annoyed that it's happening. Do you back fully the Communities Minister, Gordon Lyons, from the DUP, who says he doesn't have the necessary resources at his disposal to mitigate the potential £150 million cost? Is he right to say that and not move resources from elsewhere to try to cover this cost?
Well, we've also, as a committee, written to the Minister to see what engagement he's having with the Department for Work and Pensions. Because the reality is there's going to be a disproportionate impact here in the North. I will work with the Minister and anyone else who is seeking to oppose these cuts. OK, let's bring in Jerry Carroll. I just want to put to you what Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, said in defence of this strategy in answer to a question in the House of Commons from the SDLP's Colm Eastwood. He said the current system is morally and economically indefensible and nobody should be defending the broken status quo. And then this, we're proceeding on three principles: that if you can work, you should work. If you need help into work, the state should help, not hinder you. And if you can never work, you must be supported and protected. What's wrong with that?
I just want to thank Colin for his earlier words at the start of the show, Mark. I mean, there's a lot wrong with that statement from Keir Starmer. I mean, obviously, the state isn't adequately supporting people who are on benefits. It isn't a strong enough social safety net. And if people obviously want to and are able to physically and mentally work, they should be supported. But barriers need to be removed from them. And the question is whether there are enough accessible jobs for people with disabilities and people with illnesses. And I don't think that there are. The Centre for Social Justice, Mark, said that only 9% of employers in the UK believe there was a good business case, that's a quote, to employ people with disabilities. So I think this plan is not only cruel, it shows that Labour are in many ways more cruel than the Tories, but it's not going to work. It's not going to force people back into work. It's going to force more and more people into poverty. And I think what we need to challenge as well is misconceptions about people who are disabled and people who are on benefits, which the Prime Minister has chatted them out right throughout this week.
OK, so a lot of politicians here are unhappy, and Colin Gildernew already made the point. It's not just politicians here in Northern Ireland who aren't pleased with this latest development. It's politicians right across the United Kingdom. The question is, what needs to be done? You can say you don't like it. You can demand that the government doesn't go down this road. And then what?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I mean, I think the executive needs to turn this into a crisis for the Labour Party, and this is going to be a crisis for ordinary people, people on benefits and people with disabilities. And I think the first point should be, what fight are they going to put to the British government? They've come out with statements, some of them strong, some of them less strong, but seem to be opposed to this strategy. But if the British government pursue with this policy, the question of mitigations come into play. And what is the Executive Party going to do? What is the Finance Minister, John O'Dowd, going to allocate to mitigate against this? So I think both can be done at the same time. You can robustly challenge and refute this backwards regressive policy, but also if the British government plough ahead like they did with the winter fuel payment, an executive should refuse to implement those cuts and implement a supporting package to support people in my community and right across the north who will be disadvantaged.
OK, so what then is your clear message to the Communities Minister, Gordon Lyons? He says he doesn't have the necessary resources at his disposal to mitigate this potential shortfall of £150 million. Are you saying that you don't accept that and that he has to find a way to get the extra 150 million?
He does have to find a way. The executive as a whole need to find a way.
But you know how tight the finances are at Stormont already.
I do indeed, and I sit on the Finance Committee and I go through some of these debates, Mark. I mean, we also have a industrial derating policy where big companies are getting handouts by the taxpayer. We talked about benefits a lot the last week. One thing that hasn't been talked about is housing benefit, which is over £35 billion across in the north and across the UK. The reason why that's so high is because parties have not implemented rent controls. I have a private members bill. We're trying to implement rent controls and rent reduction, but if rent was reduced, then the cost, obviously, of making up the shortfall for housing benefit would reduce as well. So there's things that Stormont could be doing to make it a bit easier for people who are really fearful with this announcement in the last few days. OK.
Colin Gildernew, you, of course, chair the Communities Committee at Stormont. It strikes me that there are three choices here available to you, and I want to know which one you're going to back as chair of the committee and as a prominent member of Sinn Féin. You can demand that the Minister reallocates resources to mitigate this potential shortfall. You can revenue raise to find extra money to make up the 150 million, or you can simply accept it reluctantly and know that there is nothing you can do. Which of those three is your choice?
So I've already identified that the problem here is British government cuts. You mentioned yourself, Mark, that when Britain sneezes, we catch a cold. The British government do not care, and clearly in cutting the winter fuel, they very actively demonstrated that they literally don't care about people here being cold. So the problem is with the British cuts. That's where the opposition needs to be, and no one should deflect or undermine the pressure on the British government to remove these unjustifiable cuts.
OK, but the difficulty is that the British government has made its position very clear, and you will have seen many interviews with Fleur Anderson from the Northern Ireland office, and indeed the Secretary of State, Hilary Benn, and he spoke on The View a couple of weeks ago, made it very, very clear. This is the biggest financial settlement in the history of Northern Ireland. You've never had it so good, and you're not getting any more. The resources have been allocated to you, and as politicians at Stormont, it's up to you now to make the difficult choices. That's it.
Well, the British government have acknowledged that they have been underfunding for decades here, putting public services under severe pressure. That will have to be addressed, and that will have to be reversed. The British Labour government should step away from austerity policies of the predecessors and should start investing in supporting people, supporting communities, and supporting public services. That is the way forward and what needs to happen.
OK, Jerry Carroll, on Thursday night on The View, the DUP MP Carla Lockhart said she believes part of the problem here is that there needs to be a crackdown on fraud within the benefit system. Now, she wasn't talking specifically about PIP, because we know, and we had an expert on the programme who told us that the PIP fraud is actually very small, between 0 and 0.2%. But she says the bigger issue of fraud more generally within the benefit system is at least part of the problem. Does she have a point?
I don't think so. I mean, it's an attempt to deflect and they kick the poor and kick the vulnerable. I mean, this latest round of cuts, Mark, has come at the same time that Keir Starmer has announced an extra £6 billion to be spent on the war in Ukraine. Whilst most people across the world want a ceasefire, he's ramping up the pressure, and part of the cuts for benefits, disabled benefits being cut, will in part create more disabled people abroad through wars and the destruction and the death and carnage that causes. So I don't believe that parties should be engaging in the language that Keir Starmer and his party have adopted, and shouldn't be adopting any shameful attacks on people who are on benefits. People on benefits are struggling to get by. Most of them are in poverty, and we should actually be addressing that and actually the limits already of an underfunded social security system, rather than playing the language of Keir Starmer. OK, well, we'll see how the debate at Stormont goes in the weeks ahead. Jerry Carroll, Colin Gildernew, thanks both very much indeed for joining us on the programme today. We appreciate your time. Let's have a word with my guest of the day, John Manley from the Irish News, who's been listening to that. Well, I mean, not happy. Two politicians not happy, and they are in line with many other politicians at Stormont who are not happy. But the question still remains precisely what the tactic needs to be to deal with this. It seems to be demand that the government doesn't go down this road and ask for more money.
Well, yes, I suppose first off, it's another example of how this Labour administration has disappointed, I suppose, not only people on the left, but collectively in Northern Ireland. How the parties in the executive address it is another matter. The outrage seems inverse to the potential solutions to the matter. I think it's something that opposition will have to be concentrated at Westminster. That will probably bring up the inevitable questions about Sinn Féin's abstentionist policy, which will get, I imagine, the usual answer. But there needs to be, if anything, a bit of lobbying of Labour backbenchers, of the other. They've written to the other administrations to try and get some collective movement. But I'm not sure where the leverage comes from in this.
Yeah, and in the past we've seen decisions taken in Westminster that politicians have had to mitigate here. Welfare reform, the winter fuel payments, that's happened, but it's cost money within the Stormont budget. That could happen this time round, but the minister responsible says he doesn't have any spare cash, and he doesn't seem minded to move money from elsewhere to cover this cost, even though Jerry Carroll is saying that's what needs to happen. Do you think there's any chance of that being what does indeed happen?
Oh, I doubt it very much. It's not 150 million, but that's a conservative estimation. You know, some people have speculated it could be as much as 300 million. Isn't an insurmountable figure, but it would already put pressure on a tight budget. And I don't see, without any additional revenue-raising measures, how that can be covered.
And you mentioned revenue-raising, because there we are. We're back to that again. I mean, that is the concept that, you know, we dare not mention its name. Our politicians seem distinctly unenthusiastic about it, but are they going to have to consider that now if they want to plug this hole? I
think that's inevitable. And also, you see on Thursday night on The View, there was all the rhetoric about taxing the rich. Yet all the Stormont parties or all the executive parties are opposed to phasing out the inheritance tax for the wealthiest farmers, for example. So, you know, you can't please everybody. I think being in government demands tough decisions.
Yeah, it certainly does. We'll see if there are any forthcoming. John, for now, thanks very much indeed. We'll hear from you a little bit later in the programme, of course. Next, we turn to an issue that's been debated in the Assembly chamber and is becoming a real cause for concern for those affected by it. Clinics that administer products like Botox and lip fillers are unregulated here. Now, one young woman who had a procedure go wrong has called on the Health Minister to introduce tighter laws. Our reporter Faye Kidd has more.
Have you noticed more shops like these popping up over Northern Ireland? There's been a rise in the number of people seeking non-surgical cosmetic treatments like dermal fillers or anti-wrinkle toxin, also known as Botox. The procedure costs around £250. It's completely legal here in Northern Ireland, but there are concerns over the training and expertise of some of the people carrying out the services. Why are you so passionate about regulation in your industry?
I'm a nurse, and so therefore we have a code of professional conduct to adhere to. Everything that we do is underpinned by our ethics and morals, and we know that the lack of regulation is harming the public and patients. I also am a mother of 5. I have 3 daughters, And it just baffles me that in 2025 there is still no talk of regulation really coming to Northern Ireland, but also the whole of the UK. We definitely need to have a minimum level of qualification before anyone is deemed safe to be injecting anything into anybody's face.
So it sounds so simple in practice. Why doesn't the government just do it then?
How does the government come in and then take away a lot of families' only ability to earn money and provide for their families? Also, there's a lot of money in the aesthetics industry, and there's no doubt about it that the government makes a lot of money from that. But the government is the only one in all of this that can make this change, that can make it safer.
Those providing treatments don't currently have to register with any public body. And despite a rise in teenagers getting lip filler, there isn't an actual law to protect under 18s. And when things do go wrong with the procedure, or someone takes a reaction to the product, there can be serious implications. Becky started using fillers 6 years ago. At first she had positive results, until she decided to try out a cheaper option.
I was young, really. I think I was very, very naive to it. I booked in just for $500,000. I got my treatment. After I was finished, she showed me a mirror. I noticed that my lips had went white. And I asked her about it. I was like, why are my lips white? She said, oh, don't worry, it's just part of the swelling, like, you know, it'll go away. I was in severe pain. It was more sore than any of the other times, which did worry me a little bit. I ended up, when I got the treatment done, I actually went home and had a wee sleep. And when I woke up, my lips had gone purple. There was really, really severe swelling. It wasn't until I had talked to another practitioner, I actually found out that I had vascular erosion. So it was quite scary. It's basically when it hits like a blood vessel. Severe cases are that the tissue can go dead around your lips. You know, things can go really, really wrong, and I could have been really severely disfigured.
And what would you say to younger people maybe who are out there and they really, really want this done and they've seen a cheap deal? What advice would you give to them?
Don't do it. Honestly, do not do it. It is not worth it.
Campaign group Save Face is a register of accredited practitioners and clinics. They received 136 complaints about complications in Northern Ireland last year. Belfast surgeon Chris Hu says he gets over 15 patients a year coming to him for intervention for so-called botched jobs.
From a non-surgical perspective or injectable perspective, it is usually either the product is in the wrong place or the product's used for the wrong reasons.
Do you really need a nursing or a medical degree to carry out injectable procedures?
Yes.
Why?
These are potentially permanent or semi-permanent procedures which can cause a great deal of harm. It is not enough to know about the product and potential complications. What about physiology about the patient? What about the rest of the patient's medical conditions? What about understanding the complexities behind mental disorders and so forth? We need to set a standard somewhere, and the standard needs to be high enough to ensure the safety not only of the patients but also of the practitioners.
We caught up with clinical psychologist Dr. Tara Logan Buckley.
One of the biggest things, I suppose, is the rise of social media. And if we look at, let's say, we know ourselves, Instagram, everyone's putting their best self forward. The photos are edited, they're highly filtered. And what we're looking at is we're thinking that that's the ideal. And this is basically the standard that we're trying to achieve, which is impossible. People who spend more time on social media are using more filters, are comparing themselves. And what this has is this is a direct negative correlation with their own self-esteem. They have higher rates of anxiety and depression, modern adolescents, compared to what we've seen before as well.
The Department of Health say they have no plans to introduce mandatory licensing for non-surgical cosmetic procedures. They say that any future review of regulations is contingent on available resources. In December last year, all of the parties supported a Sinn Féin motion calling for proper regulation here.
I think that it's really important that the Minister now deliver on what the asks of that motion were, and he does need to bring forward some legislation. The committee are here to help. I mean, if he works with the committee, we want to help him and assist him. No legislation to date has come before the committee in relation to anything, and we really want to do some legislation. That's what we're here to do.
Legislation for tougher regulation and to make it illegal to administer Botox or fillers for under 18s is already passed in England. Conversations are underway in Scotland, Wales and in the Republic of Ireland too. There is clear cross-party support here in the Chamber and amongst most professionals in the aesthetics industry. But with so many other pressures, will the Health Minister make this a priority for 2025?
And that was Faye Kidd reporting. Now, the proposed changes to PIP payments last week caused quite a stir, but is there even more pain to come? The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, will present her spring statement to the House of Commons on Wednesday, and there's no expectation that it'll include much in the way of good cheer. Joining me now to discuss what's likely to be included in the statement is Lucy Fisher from the Financial Times. Lucy, welcome to the programme. Today's front pages do suggest there are big challenges on the horizon. Sunday Telegraph suggesting the Chancellor's taking an axe to the civil service. The Sunday Times says the civil service budget's to be slashed by £1.5 billion. The Observer says all families will be worse off by 2030. It's not very happy reading today, is it?
Well, no, it's not. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has been out and about on the airwaves this morning confirming that cuts of around 15% to civil service budgets are coming down the line. She says it will sort of eliminate some of the backroom office functions, some of the administrative costs, which sound like small scale things. But unsurprisingly, the reaction today from Whitehall unions has been, you can't just cut those functions and expect everything to work. If the government wants to make severe efficiencies of this scale, it needs to work out which parts of the civil service it doesn't want to operate and exist anymore.
Yeah, and the difficulty will be that it's not even a year since the general election, and this is not precisely what people were expecting when the Labour government was returned and the Tories were thrown out.
Well, that's right. And in a sense, I think Labour campaigned on this slogan of change without filling in much of the detail. One of the other priorities that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer set out was trying to turbocharge economic growth. And so far, that doesn't seem to have come off. I think one of the key messages we'll all be poring over next Wednesday is the downgrading of the growth forecasts. We think from about 2% a year to 1%, so a halving of the growth estimates. And of course, that is just kryptonite for a government. If you don't have the money, particularly if you're a Labour government, you can't channel it into public services and the improvements that you've sort of promised to the public. So I think it's a very difficult moment for Rachel Reeves, and it will be a difficult few months ahead because we'll get some details next week of the overall spending envelope for the next 3 years after 2025-26, where budgets are already set. But we won't see the detail of exactly where most of those cuts will fall until the spending review in June.
And of course, Rachel Reeves has got these self-imposed rules, and her opponents say she could breach them, break them, set them aside entirely if she wanted to. But I wonder what you think. How much longer can this Labour administration continue to blame the Tories and what the Conservative government did in the past for the decisions it's having to take now?
Well, look, on the fiscal rules, I have been interested that, Labour MPs and Labour peers have in recent weeks been urging Rachel Reeves to change those rather than reach for spending cuts or tax rises in order to make her budget sort of add up. She's not going to do that. She's been crystal clear. Those are ironclad. And indeed, she and Treasury allies would argue that anything else wouldn't wash with the market. We saw what happened in Germany when they've changed the rules to sort of borrow more for defence and the cost of government borrowing has spiralled over there. So there are arguments against doing that in the UK. As for how Labour can kind of get away with, blaming the Tories, I think there is still an argument to be made that a lot of the current economic circumstances are underscored by COVID and the Ukraine war. And of course, some of the current issues we're seeing, including interest rates being higher than expected, which of course makes the cost of servicing public debt more expensive. Some of that, has been precipitated by the threat of a trade war and some of what's going on with Donald Trump's economic policy, which reverberates around the world. So there are these global factors, but it does feel that, the UK public doesn't have, much truck with Labour. It was called a loveless landslide when they won, albeit a seismic Commons majority, but with only 34% of the national vote share last year. And, the party's ratings have continued to sort of tumble since then.
OK, very interesting to hear what she has to say in detail, the Chancellor, on Wednesday in that spring statement. But for now, Lucy, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Lucy Fisher there from the Financial Times. This time for a final word with John Manley from the Irish News. There are going to be difficult decisions to be taken. And what's interesting is that some of the big spending departments across the water will be protected. Health and defence, for example, we know defence spending is probably going to go up, which means that the unprotected departments are going to bear the brunt of this. And that's going to mean spending in places like Northern Ireland could be squeezed even further.
Yes, it looks like it. You said in your intro, Mark, about when Britain sneezes, Northern Ireland gets a cold. In yesterday's Irish News, Patrick Murphy characterises when Britain is broke, Northern Ireland gets battered. So I think we can expect much more a squeezing of things, and all couched in this terms of the world is changing. I think, that, as Lucy says, there is mileage in blaming the Tories, like Stormont can blame the British government for imposing cuts, but you have to deal with the hand that you're given. And at the moment, platitudes and outrage won't pay people's bills.
Yeah, and some of the parties here who welcomed Labour into government, welcomed that the decision of the UK electorate last July, may now be wondering precisely what was clear at that time and what's now surprising them all. For example, the SDLP's critics are saying, well, you welcomed Labour, you sit with Labour, you're supportive of Labour, you don't like what's happening with PIPs, but you're partly responsible.
Well, as I said earlier, there have been countless examples of how Keir Starmer's administration has left on the left, whether it be in its support for Israel, cutting international aid, failure to repeal the Legacy Act as possible, as promised. So yes, there have been. I'm not sure that the likes of the SDLP will continually seek to disassociate themselves from them, but that doesn't get any closer to solving the problems that are coming down Stormont's way.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how this unfolds across the water this week, and also what the implications are up at Stormont.
I think so. I think thus far we haven't seen any solution, so I would just expect more rhetoric for this week.
OK, a lot more political debate for sure. Lots of heat. Who knows how much light there's going to be. John, as ever, thank you very much indeed. That's all we've got time for today. I'll be back on Thursday night with The View at the usual time of 10:40 on BBC One and iPlayer. Do join me for that. And before that, we'll have a fresh Red Lines podcast, this time looking closely at the spring statement and what it might mean for the pound in your pocket. That'll drop on Wednesday on BBC Sounds. For now, though, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.